Thank you for watching this SciAp webinar on effective feedback. I'm Brodie Gregory, and I'm a senior consultant at PDRI, which is part of the CEB family. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about some new and classic research about what makes for effective feedback exchanges. But I'm going to talk about it in the context of being immediately applicable to your work and your life. Let's start with a business case for feedback. These days, everyone seems to be talking about the ratings debate in performance management. Do we use ratings or do we not use ratings? But fewer people are talking about the behaviors that actually drive performance. CEB research has shown that the biggest driver of high performance is getting frequent, informal feedback. But the reality is, most people dread both giving and receiving feedback. My goal for this session is for you to walk away with a few ideas that are immediately applicable to your work and life, regardless of whether you are a student, an academic, or a practitioner. At the end of this short session, you should understand the 4 key components of any feedback exchange. You will also walk away with 3 specific tips for being a better feedback provider, and also with 3 specific tips for being a better feedback recipient, all based on research. You can apply those tips for yourself or incorporate them into your work with clients and colleagues. Feedback is everywhere. You get it from other people, from objects, like when you step on the scale or look at your speedometer, and you even generate feedback for yourself anytime you regulate your behavior. Feedback is useful for 3 big reasons. 1, it holds up the proverbial mirror, allowing you to learn more about yourself, your behavior, and to increase your self-awareness. 2, feedback is truly the best way to assess progress between where you are and where you want to be. This notion comes from control theory, which states that feedback is the best source of information for gauging the distance between your goal state and your current state. For instance, if you want to weigh 150 pounds and the scale tells you that you weigh 155 pounds, that feedback is telling you that you have some work to do to close that gap. Third reason, positive feedback tells you what to keep doing, and negative feedback tells you what to change in order to get better. Many people dislike receiving negative feedback, which is unfortunate because it is actually the most useful and informative type of feedback. It tells you what you need to do differently to be better. Research by Medvedev et al. Shows that negative process feedback in particular is most helpful because it tells you what you need to do differently as you are working on something, as opposed to once you have completed the task or activity. The tips I will share with you today will help negative feedback feel a little less daunting to both give and to receive. Now that we know more about why feedback matters, let's talk about the 4 components that are part of any feedback exchange. Any feedback exchange includes the 4 elements that you can see on the screen. This model comes from a book that Paul Levy and I recently wrote for APA on using feedback in organizational consulting. We reviewed decades of feedback research, including some of the most influential models from Taylor, Fisher and Ilgen, Kluger and Denisi, and London and Smither, among others. We distilled their feedback models down to the 4 most basic components, and this model provides a simple and streamlined framework for thinking about feedback. Extensive research has been done for each of these 4 components. For a long time, feedback research focused largely on the component that you see in the middle of the model, the actual message. Researchers particularly focused on feedback sign, finding, not surprisingly, that people like positive feedback a lot more than negative feedback. But to fully understand the impact of negative feedback, we need to step back and look at the other 3 components of this model, including characteristics and behaviors of the feedback source or provider, characteristics of the feedback recipient, and the context in which feedback is provided. Attributes of the feedback source, such as credibility and trustworthiness, impact how the recipient perceives and reacts to feedback they receive. Characteristics of the feedback recipient, such as their feedback orientation, their personality, or their locus of control, impact how open to and accepting they are of feedback, as well as their likelihood of taking action on the feedback. More recent research has examined the impact of the context in which feedback is provided. For instance, feedback recipients tend to be more open to and accepting of feedback when it's given as soon as possible after the event occurs, when it's given in a private as opposed to public setting, and when it's given within an organization that has a healthy feedback environment. I could go on and on for hours about these 4 components of feedback exchanges, but instead I want to focus on giving you a few very practical and useful tips on both giving and receiving feedback. Let's start with 3 things that you can do right away to be better at giving feedback. These are 1, focus on the behavior, not the person when giving feedback. 2, make your feedback as actionable as possible. And 3, be specific and concise in your feedback. I'll talk about each of these in detail, and I also have an example to illustrate each one using a few friendly SciOp members who volunteered to help out. So, our first tip. Anytime you give feedback, it should always focus on the behavior, not the person, including their abilities, personality, or character. It's easy to change your behavior, but not so easy to change who you are. If you give someone critical feedback on who they are as a person, they are more likely to get defensive and less likely to do anything about it. For a long time, there was an assumption that this only mattered for negative feedback, that it was okay to praise people for their abilities or who they are as a person. But research done in the last 10 to 15 years has shown that this rule applies to both positive and negative feedback. Carol Dweck's stream of research has consistently shown that praising people's abilities as opposed to their hard work makes them less resilient to failure in the future. If they attribute their successes to their abilities, they also learn to attribute their failures to their abilities. If you are having a hard time discerning if your feedback is focused on behavior or the person, one easy rule of thumb is to make sure you use words like "you do this" or "you did this" as opposed to "you are this." For example, let's say I'm giving feedback to my great friend, co-author, and PhD advisor, Paul Levy from the University of Akron. I say, "Paul, you are just so darn smart." Note, I'm saying "you are this" as opposed to "you do this." I'm praising his abilities rather than his actions or behavior, and that's the wrong way. Fortunately, Paul is an expert on feedback, so he calls me out on it, saying, "Brodie, I think what you meant to say is that I clearly answered all of your questions about goal-setting theory in a way that you could understand." Paul's version of the feedback is much better. Had I given him this feedback, it would have been clear to him exactly what it was that he did well and how he helped me, therefore making it easier to repeat the same good behavior in the future. Contrast this with my original feedback statement, which did not give him any information about what he did well or how he helped me. This gets us to our next tip, which is to make your feedback actionable. The whole point of giving feedback is because we want to see people do less of a bad behavior, more of a good behavior, or something different entirely. One of the challenges is that feedback is inherently backward-looking. We are sharing observations based on things that people have already done with the hope that we can influence their behavior in the future. People often get defensive when they receive negative feedback, and it's no wonder. The feedback feels like a criticism for something that already happened, and it's too late to do anything about it. But one simple change in the way that we deliver feedback can make people feel as though they are getting a do-over. Follow your feedback with a question like, "If this were to happen again tomorrow, what would you have me do differently?" This broadens people's thinking and gets them into problem-solving mode as opposed to feeling defensive and attempting to justify their past actions. Let's look at an example. Let's pretend that last week I watched a webinar delivered by the wonderful Candace Young at Microsoft. After the webinar, I tell Candace, "Hey Candace, I meant to tell you, during your entire presentation last week, I couldn't see the slides and your voice was so quiet I couldn't hear you." Well, it's a week later, so is it any surprise that Candace responds by saying, "What do you want me to do, build a time machine?" And she's right. The way that I gave the feedback does not give her an opportunity to change. But if I make my feedback forward-looking, Candace is much more open to and accepting of my feedback. For instance, if I say to Candace, "Candace, in your presentation last week, I couldn't see the slides and your voice was so quiet I couldn't hear you. Next week, when you present, you might want to speak up and make sure we can see your slides. Why don't we do a test run before the presentation to make sure everything is working okay, which Candace thinks is a great idea. In this example, I shared the same feedback with her, but gave her an opportunity to repair the situation by talking about next time and not just looking back to last week's presentation. Our third tip for giving better feedback is to be as specific and concise as you can be. Dating back to Ilgen, Fisher, and Taylor's seminal 1979 article on the feedback process, research has consistently shown that the more specific feedback is, the more effective it is. Specific feedback allows the feedback recipient to clearly understand what they did well or poorly, and, ideally, in what situation. The more specific the feedback, the easier it is for the recipient to identify exactly what they need to do more of, less of, or differently in the future. Vague or general feedback is harder for the recipient to take action on because they may not be able to discern exactly what the issue is. Feedback should also be concise and to the point. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is that they get uncomfortable giving feedback and they ramble on and on. The message gets lost or diluted, and you leave the other person feeling very unsure of what the actual issue is. This is especially true when you have to give challenging feedback that you feel uncomfortable giving. One way to ensure that your feedback is specific, concise, and to the point is to use a framework like situation, behavior, impact, which I first learned about from the Center for Creative Leadership. With the SBI framework, you describe the situation, the person's specific behavior, and the impact of that behavior, why it mattered. You can also add the desired behavior on the end, what you want the person to do differently next time. When you give feedback like this, it's very clear to people what the issue is. Also, because you describe the specific situation and an observable behavior, it's harder for people to refute. For example, Adam Massman at Rockwell Collins is great at giving specific and constructive feedback. In the example that you see on the screen, he says to me, "Brodie, in that meeting with your HR business partners last Friday, you didn't leave time at the end for questions, and as a result, many walked away feeling unsure about their responsibilities on the project." Adam clearly states what the situation is, the meeting with my HR business partners last Friday. He clearly states what my behavior was. I didn't leave time at the end for questions. And he tells me the impact of my behavior, why it matters. In this case, many of the HR business partners walked away from the meeting feeling unsure about their responsibilities on the project. Because Adam's feedback was clear, concise, and specific, I knew exactly what I did, in what situation, and why it mattered. So to repair the situation, I tell Adam that I will reach out to the HR business partners later today and set up time to address all of their questions. Now, let's talk about 3 things that you can do right away to be a better feedback recipient. Someone can give the best feedback in the world, but what really matters is how the recipient perceives it, whether they accept it, and whether or not they actually do anything with it. So, when someone else gives you feedback, here are 3 things that you can do that will make an enormous difference. 1, give cognition time to catch up with emotion. 2, make the most out of any feedback exchange, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. And finally, proactively seek out feedback. Don't just wait around for other people to offer it to you. Let's start with cognition and emotion. The last time someone gave you feedback, did you experience that immediate flash of emotion that made you feel offended or defensive? If so, don't worry, that's very common. When you get negative feedback or criticism, a common response is to have an immediate emotional reaction to it. Our emotional reactions occur faster than cognition, and as a result, anytime we receive feedback, and especially negative feedback, we first experience that hot emotional reaction, and it takes a while for cool cognition to catch up. Emotion helps us survive threatening situations, but can also get us in trouble when we don't know how to work with it. Next time someone gives you critical feedback, recognize that immediate emotional reaction, but allow time for it to pass before reacting so that you can mindfully process the feedback you receive and think rationally about it. Research has consistently shown that being able to mindfully process feedback is critical to accepting and taking action on the feedback that we receive. For example, I'll use my friend Nita Moy from the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland to help me illustrate this one. Nita sends me a text that simply says, "That meeting didn't go so well, Brodie." Not only is the feedback critical, but it's delivered via a medium that doesn't allow me to see Nita's face, hear her tone, or see her body language. Therefore, it's very open to interpretation, and my initial reaction is to feel defensive and have hurt feelings. One problem with text messages is that they make it really easy for us to react and respond immediately, sometimes without really thinking. Had I responded immediately after receiving Nita's feedback text, I probably would have said something very different than if I waited an hour and allowed time to cool off and think about her feedback. After allowing time to mindfully process the feedback, I see that this experience is an opportunity to learn, and I respond by asking, "What do you think we could do better next time, Nita?" This response gets us to our second tip for being a great feedback recipient, making the most of any feedback exchange. In an ideal world, all of the feedback that you receive would be given in a timely manner, in a private setting. It would be specific, actionable, behavior-focused, and to the point. But the reality is, most people are uncomfortable giving feedback and generally don't do it very well. So, you can't control how well someone else gives you feedback, but you can control how you respond to it. Should you find yourself on the receiving end of a mediocre feedback exchange, keep a few things in mind. First, remember that the other person is probably very uncomfortable giving the feedback and is worried about how you're going to respond. Second, if the feedback is delivered poorly, you will probably have that strong emotional reaction and therefore feel less likely to accept the feedback. So remember to give yourself some time to process it mindfully. Third, definitely remember that you have the ability to salvage the feedback exchange simply by asking some targeted questions. If someone gives you bad feedback, you can salvage the exchange by asking a simple question like, "Can you tell me more?" Or, "What would you like to see me do differently next time?" Or, "Can you give me an example so that I can better understand what I do and when I do it?" Using questions like these is also a great way to keep a civil dialogue when the feedback is critical or challenging. If you find yourself getting defensive, you can use this as a strategy to buy you some time, to help you better understand the issue, and to get more information. Let's take a look at an example. So, in this example, the delightful Andy Biga from JetBlue Airlines says to me, "Hey Brodie, next time we have a PSYOP committee meeting, it would be great if you could send the dial-in details ahead of time." In reality, I had sent the details way in advance in a calendar invite. So, my initial reaction to Andy is to get defensive and dismiss his feedback, thinking, "What is he talking about? I did send them. Whatever." But a much more constructive response would be for me to clarify by saying, "Thanks, Andy. I had sent the dial-in details a few weeks early and then again right before the meeting to make sure that everyone had them. Did you not get the details that I sent a few weeks ago?" Asking whether or not he got the details I sent a few weeks ago is an example of a closed-ended question, which is great to clarify or to confirm. However, open-ended questions, those that cannot be answered with yes or no, are even more effective for getting the feedback provider to be more specific, provide you with an example, or offer additional information. This brings us to our final tactic that you can use to be a better feedback recipient, and that is proactively seeking out feedback. One of the easiest ways to ensure that you get feedback often enough, become more comfortable receiving feedback, and develop your feedback orientation, and even to make it easier for others to give you feedback, is to proactively ask for it. A 2015 meta-analysis from Frederick Onseal and colleagues showed that individuals who actively seek out feedback have higher job satisfaction and are more successful at building work relationships, networking, and other socialization behaviors. Other research has also demonstrated a link between feedback seeking and performance, although this was negligible in the Onseal et al. Study. When you ask for feedback, the more specific your question is, the easier it is for the other person to provide feedback. A specific question will tell them exactly what actions or behaviors you are seeking feedback on. To make it even easier for them to respond, you can also make your question forward-looking by asking a question like, what do you think I could do better next time? Or what did I do well that I should continue doing in the future? So let's look at one more illustrative example. And for this last example, we get help from my colleague Maya Garza at PDRI. In this example, I seek feedback from Maya by asking, hey Maya, I'm trying to improve my presentation skills, particularly my pace and the clarity of what I say. You attended my presentation this morning. If I were going to present again tomorrow, what is one thing you suggest I do differently? Note that my question is very specific. I tell her that I'm interested in developing my presentation skills and also note what specific aspects of my presentation skills I'm focused on. I ask her to think about a very recent event, my presentation this morning. And I also make my request forward-looking by asking her what I should do differently if I were to present again tomorrow. The specificity of my request makes it easy for Maya to respond. She tells me, I'm glad you asked, Brodie. I thought your presentation was thorough, and one thing you can do next time to be better is slow down. In today's presentation, you spoke fast and also went through your content quickly. Next time, consider slowing down a little so that the audience fully hears and understands everything that you are sharing with them. Because I told Maya exactly what I was looking for, it was easy for her to provide me with specific feedback about things I could have done better in my presentation this morning and can also try next time I present. Because of this great exchange, I'll be more likely to seek feedback from Maya in the future, and she will feel more comfortable providing me with feedback. Now, we're coming up near the end of our time together, so to summarize, when you give feedback, remember to focus on the behavior, not the person, when you provide feedback, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. Make your feedback actionable and forward-looking so that the recipient will be more likely to accept and use your feedback. And be as specific and concise as possible so that your message is clear and easy for the recipient to understand. When you receive feedback, remember to give cognition time to catch up with emotion. Let that initial emotional reaction pass so that you can think mindfully about the feedback you received. Make the most of the feedback exchange. Remember, you can't control the quality of feedback that others provide to you, but you can seek to clarify and ask great questions in order to salvage the interaction. And finally, don't just wait around for others to offer you feedback. Proactively seek it out. It will make it easier for others to give you feedback in the future. It will make you more comfortable with feedback over time and probably help your performance, development, and self-awareness. So at the beginning of this webinar, I told you that my goal was for you to walk away from this session with a few ideas that are immediately applicable to your work and to your life, regardless of whether you're a student, an academic, or a practitioner. In addition to our tips for being a better feedback provider and recipient, remember that any feedback exchange involves 4 key components: the actual feedback message, characteristics and behaviors of the feedback provider and the feedback recipient, and also the context in which feedback is given. I would be delighted to answer any questions that you have or get on the phone and chat about feedback anytime. Please feel free to send me an email at brodie.gregory@pdri.com. And thank you so much for watching this webinar, and have a great day.